Welcome to NightStoryX Fear, where every whisper hides a secret and every story leaves a scar. If you dare to listen, then like, share, and subscribe before the darkness takes you. And tell us in the comments what haunts you the most. NightStoryX Fear, where fear never sleeps.
Story 1. The Echoing Resort of Whispering Pines, Wisconsin. Chloe and Liam, newly married, chose a quaint rustic resort nestled deep within the north woods of Wisconsin, near a sprawling ancient pine forest known as Whispering Pine. Their cabin, the Loon's Nest, sat at the very edge of the property, backing onto the dense, silent woods. The first day was idyllic. However, on their second night, around 2 a.m., Chloe woke to a faint, rhythmic ticking sound from the living room. Liam was asleep. She crept out to find the antique grandfather clock, its pendulum swinging erratically, far too fast, the hands frozen at 3:15. As she watched, the pendulum suddenly stopped dead. Then a low, drawn-out sigh echoed from the dark, unlit hallway, so profound and sorrowful it raised goosebumps. She quickly retreated to bed. The next day, Liam, ever practical, dismissed it. That night, the phenomena escalated. A cold spot formed directly in the center of their bed, palpable even through the duvet, slowly expanding. Then a distinct childlike giggle emanated from the closet, soft and sweet, but profoundly unsettling. Liam, now awake, swept his flashlight into the small cedar-lined closet. Nothing. But as he closed the door, a faint wispy imprint of a small hand appeared on the inside of the wooden panel, briefly visible before fading. The next morning they tried to laugh it off, but later, returning from breakfast, every item in Chloe's toiletry bag had been meticulously arranged on the bathroom counter in a perfect circle around her toothbrush, each bottle facing inwards. Liam's things remained untouched. That night, fear was a physical presence. They tried to stay awake, but exhaustion claimed them. Chloe woke suddenly to a piercing, guttural scream from Liam, thrashing violently beside her. His eyes were wide open, glazed with terror, fixed on something above her, something she couldn't see. He pointed a trembling finger past her, choking, the face. Before she could fully comprehend, an agonizing pressure clamped down on her chest, pushing the air from her lungs. She couldn't scream, couldn't move. She felt a cold, heavy weight pressing her into the mattress, and a putrid, sweet smell filling her nostrils like decaying flowers and damp earth. She looked up, desperate to see what Liam saw. Hovering directly above her, just inches from her face, was a swirling, indistinct mass of shadow, coalescing and dissipating. Within its depths, she could make out fleeting, distorted features, the wide, vacant eyes of a child, the emaciated jaw of a woman, and the furious snarl of an unseen beast, all shifting and blending, staring directly into her soul. The weight on her chest intensified, crushing, making her vision blur. She could hear Liam's panicked gurgles beside her, his struggle fading. She closed her eyes, begging for it to end. When she finally opened them, gasping for air, the shadow was gone. The cabin silent, the terrifying cold retreated. Liam was staring blankly at the ceiling, unmoving, his breath shallow and ragged. The next morning, they packed in a frenzy, abandoning their honeymoon. Liam seemed fine, but he couldn't recall anything from that night. Days later, back home, Chloe noticed a small, circular, unnaturally dark bruise on her sternum, exactly where the weight had been. Liam, however, started experiencing terrifying night terrors, screaming about a shifting face and a rotting smell. The echoing resort of Whispering Pines had not just hosted their honeymoon, it had imprinted itself upon them, leaving a chilling echo that would forever haunt their nights, a silent, unseen presence that had demanded more than just a visit.
Story 2. The Lighthouse Inn of Blackwater Reef, Oregon coast. Maya and Daniel, seeking a unique honeymoon, booked a week at the historic Blackwater Reef Lighthouse Inn, a remote bed and breakfast carved into the cliffs of the rugged Oregon coast. Their room, the keeper's loft, was at the very top. On their third night, a fierce tempest rolled in. Maya awoke to Daniel gripping her arm, his face pale. "Did you hear that?" he whispered. A faint, mournful foghorn sound echoed from within the lighthouse itself, a deep, resonating ooh. Not from the stormy ocean, but seemingly from the empty circular shaft beneath their room. The inn hadn't used a foghorn in decades. They tried to rationalize it, but the sound was too distinct. Then, their old ornate brass lamp on the bedside table began to flicker wildly, its light dimming and brightening in sync with the phantom foghorn's wails. As it flickered, elongated, distorted shadows danced across the walls, taking on vaguely humanoid forms that seemed to stretch and writhe. The air grew heavy with the smell of brine and a faint, sickly sweet scent of decay. Daniel, genuinely frightened, pulled Maya close. The foghorn stopped, and an even more unsettling sound began. A soft, rhythmic drip, drip, drip from somewhere below them, like water slowly falling onto stone. Yet their room was bone dry. The next morning, Daniel found a framed antique photograph of a stern-looking lighthouse keeper on their nightstand. It hadn't been there before. The keeper's eyes in the photo seemed to follow them. They confronted the owner, who merely smiled, saying, "Oh, old Silas likes to make his presence known. He lost his young bride to the reef in '32. Still looks for her light." That night, emboldened by wine, they decided to explore. They crept down to the base of the lighthouse, where a heavy, rusted iron door marked "No Entry" stood. As they approached, the air grew incredibly cold, and the faint, mournful foghorn sound returned, much louder now, seeming to emanate from behind the door. Through the thin gap beneath the door, a faint, greenish phosphorescence pulsed, illuminating ancient, barnacle-encrusted stone. As they pressed their ears to the cold metal, they heard it, a multitude of soft, desperate whispers from beyond the door, a chilling chorus of lost voices, all calling out, "Light! My light! Where is my light?" Then, the most terrifying sound, a single, drawn-out feminine scream, high-pitched and full of agony, followed by a sickening gurgling that lasted for agonizing seconds before abruptly cutting off. The phosphorescence intensified, and the heavy door shuddered violently, as if something immense was pressing against it from the inside, trying to burst forth. Maya and Daniel didn't wait. They fled back to their room, locking the door, barricading it with furniture. The storm raged, but now the sounds of the crashing waves seemed to carry faint, sorrowful wails that were not wind. They huddled together until dawn, too terrified to move. When the sun finally rose, the inn felt normal again. They packed in a blur, abandoning the rest of their honeymoon. As they drove away, Maya glanced at the lighthouse one last time. In one of the top windows, she saw a fleeting image, the ghostly, translucent form of a woman in an old-fashioned white dress, her hair flowing like seaweed, standing perfectly still, staring out at the turbulent ocean. And beside her, a shadow that seemed to shimmer like mist, a tall figure in a uniform, its arm gently wrapped around her. They were still there, eternally searching, eternally lost, haunting the Lighthouse Inn of Blackwater Reef. Their mournful cries and desperate whispers forever carried on the wind of the Oregon coast, calling out for a light that would never return.
Story 3: The Deserted Villa of Palo Verde, California. Sarah and Ben, adventurous, rented a sprawling, isolated villa deep in the Palo Verde desert of Southern California for their honeymoon. The villa, a relic from the 1960s with a defunct pool, was miles from town, surrounded by nothing but cacti and an oppressive silence. The first few days were peaceful. However, on their fourth night, the silence became menacing. Around 1 a.m., Sarah woke to a distinct rhythmic scratching sound from inside the walls of their bedroom. A slow, deliberate scritch, 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 as if something with long nails was meticulously dragging itself through the plaster. Then, a heavy sleeper remained oblivious. She nudged him awake. The scratching stopped. Ben, groggy, mumbled about desert critters. But as he drifted back to sleep, the scratching resumed, louder, accompanied by a faint, dry hissing, as if whatever was in the walls was agitated. It seemed to move, tracing a path directly above their bed. They spent the rest of the night huddled, listening, the villa feeling less like a getaway and more like a tomb. The next day, Ben meticulously checked every vent, but found nothing. He joked about honeymoon spooks, but visible tension hung between them. That night, the scratching began earlier, just as dusk settled. It moved from room to room, following them. No matter where they went, the slow, dry scratching and faint hissing followed, always from within the thick, stuccoed walls. Then, as they tried to relax on the patio, watching the sunset, small, perfectly spherical dust devils started to form spontaneously in the utterly still air around the dried-up pool. They weren't moving with wind. They simply appeared, spun violently for a few seconds, then vanished, leaving disturbed dust. Each time one formed, a faint, almost subliminal whisper seemed to accompany it, a sound like dry leaves rustling or secrets whispered just beyond earshot. Fear turned to outright terror when the dust devils intensified.
They began to swirl, not just on the ground, but in the air, rising to eye level, forming miniature swirling columns of sand and grit. Within the vortex of one particularly violent dust devil, just a few feet from their faces, Sarah saw it, a momentary fleeting glimpse of a contorted, elongated face, eyes wide with silent agony, its mouth a gaping maw of sand and dust. It was skeletal, ancient, and utterly horrifying. A collective dry shriek of countless voices seemed to emanate from all the swirling dust devils at once, a sound that pierced their very souls, freezing them in place. The scratching within the villa's walls intensified into a frantic scratching frenzy. They fled indoors, locking every door and window, but the scratching and the whispering shriek from outside seemed to penetrate the very foundations. Then, from beneath their bedroom door, a thin stream of reddish-brown sand began to trickle into the room, forming a growing pile. The sand moved, not by wind, but by an unseen force pushing it from the other side, slowly filling the room, accompanied by a low guttural chittering from beneath the door, as if something large and insect-like was trying to burrow its way in. The scratching stopped. The whispering shriek outside faded. All that remained was the terrifying rhythmic chittering and the relentless granular invasion of sand. They climbed onto the bed, watching in horror as the sand pile grew, knowing whatever was beyond that door was slowly, meticulously trying to bury them alive. They endured until dawn, mentally shattered. They drove away as the first light touched the desert, never looking back at the abandoned villa or the vast, silent dunes. Weeks later, Ben developed a persistent cough. Doctors found nothing, but every night when he lay down, he swore he could feel a faint, dry scratching within his own lungs, and sometimes he'd cough up small, gritty particles of reddish-brown sand. The deserted villa of Palo Verde wasn't just haunted. It was a hungry, ancient entity of the earth itself, slowly consuming those who dared to trespass, leaving behind a horrifying internal dust storm that would eventually bury them from the inside out.
Story 4. The Isolated Cabin of Shadow Lake, Minnesota. Emily and Noah, outdoors enthusiasts, chose a remote, off-grid cabin on Shadow Lake, Minnesota, deep within the Boundary Waters Canoe Area wilderness for their honeymoon. The cabin, a relic from the 1950s, was surrounded by ancient forests and the dark, mirror-like lake, which locals whispered had swallowed more than its share of secrets. Their first few days were idyllic. However, on their third night, a strange, almost imperceptible humming sound began, a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very ground beneath the cabin. It wasn't mechanical. It felt organic, like a vast, unseen engine purring deep within the earth. The humming intensified throughout the night, morphing into a low, mournful drone that vibrated through the floorboards and up into their bed. They tried to ignore it, but the sound was insidious, subtly twisting their sense of reality. The next morning, Emily found that all the water in the cabin's well pump was unnaturally warm, almost lukewarm, despite the frigid lake water from which it was drawn. Later that day, as they canoed across Shadow Lake,
they noticed patches of the normally pristine lake water were unnaturally still, almost viscous, with a strange oily sheen, and from these patches, faint swirling currents seemed to pull inwards towards the absolute center of the lake. That night, the humming became unbearable. It vibrated through their very bones, filling their heads with a dull, throbbing ache. Then the cabin's single ancient oil lamp, despite being full and well-maintained, began to dim and brighten on its own, its light pulsing in sync with the lake's unsettling drone. As the light pulsed, the shadows in the cabin seemed to stretch and contort, taking on unsettling, fleeting shapes, long, sinuous forms that slithered across the floor, or bulbous masses that pulsed in the corners of their vision. They tried to sleep, but the humming and the eerie light show were relentless. Emily, unable to bear it, stumbled out of bed and looked out the window. The lake was completely still, but directly in its center, a vast, circular patch of water was glowing with an intense, internal, luminous green light, radiating upwards, illuminating the underside of the low-hanging clouds. It wasn't reflected moonlight, it was light from within the lake itself. As she stared, horrified, the surface of the green light began to ripple and churn, forming a massive, slow-motion maelstrom. From the very center of this swirling, glowing vortex, a single, impossibly thick tentacle slowly rose from the depths, glistening with an oily, phosphorescent slime. It was colossal, black against the green light, and covered with suction cups the size of dinner plates. The humming from beneath the cabin now intensified into a deafening, guttural roar that seemed to shake the entire cabin. Noah, roused by the roar, rushed to the window, his jaw dropping. More tentacles began to emerge, countless black behemoths rising from the glowing vortex, reaching upwards into the black sky, swaying slowly, deliberately, as if searching. Each movement of the tentacles was accompanied by a sickening slurping and sucking sound that reverberated across the lake, echoing the deep hum from beneath the cabin. From the very center of the vortex, beneath the rising tentacles, a vast, dark, impossible shape began to breach the surface, a colossal, amorphous mass that dwarfed the cabin, its surface rippling with internal light and shadow. It was not a creature of this world. It was something ancient, primal, a living, hungry void. The hum from beneath the cabin was its breathing, the light was its bioluminescence, the sounds were its feeding calls. They fled the cabin in a blind panic, scrambling for their canoe, barely making it to the water before the full, horrifying form of the entity fully breached the surface, its vast dark shadow eclipsing the moon and stars. They paddled frantically, never looking back at the glowing green maw in the center of Shadow Lake, or the cabin that was now slowly, inexorably beginning to sink into the viscous green-lit water, pulled down by unseen forces. They made it to shore hours later, delirious and traumatized. They abandoned their canoe and ran through the dark forest until dawn. They never spoke of it again. But every night, Emily could still feel that subtle, resonant humming deep within her bones, and sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she saw that vast, internal green light and the terrifying black tentacles slowly rising from the depths. Shadow Lake was not just a lake, it was a hungry portal, a living, breathing entity that had chosen their honeymoon cabin as its next meal, a primal terror that still hums beneath the earth.
Story 5. The Haunted Plantation of Cypress Bayou, Louisiana. Olivia and Paul
drawn by its Gothic charm and rich history, booked their honeymoon at the notoriously haunted Cypress Bayou plantation in the sweltering lowlands of Louisiana. The old antebellum mansion, with its weeping willows and Spanish moss, had a reputation for spectral activity. Their room, the Orchid Suite, was on the second floor, overlooking the desolate, marshy bayou. On their second night, the air grew incredibly heavy and still, the kind of oppressive humidity that precedes a storm, but no storm came. Around 3 a.m., Olivia awoke to a faint, rhythmic creaking sound from the empty rocking chair in the corner of their room. It swayed slowly, deliberately, as if someone unseen had just risen from it. Paul was sound asleep. Olivia watched, frozen, as the rocking chair continued its eerie rhythm. Then, from the adjacent darkened sitting room, she heard a soft, melodious humming, a wordless lullaby, ancient and sorrowful, sung in a low, trembling alto. It was distinctly female. She nudged Paul awake, her heart pounding. He heard it too. The humming stopped. The rocking chair stilled. A profound, unnatural silence filled the room, broken only by the chirping of unseen crickets outside. The next morning, they found a single, withered white orchid placed meticulously on Paul's pillow. Neither of them had brought orchids. They mentioned it to the friendly innkeeper, who merely smiled thinly. "Oh, Miss Eleanor likes to welcome her guests, especially the newly married ones." Eleanor was the tragic young mistress of the plantation, said to have died of a broken heart after her true love vanished during the Civil War. That night, fear was a tangible presence. They tried to stay awake, but the oppressive stillness and heat eventually lulled them. Olivia woke suddenly to the sensation of an icy cold hand tracing a slow, deliberate path across her cheek. She gasped, opening her eyes to see Paul, rigid beside her, staring straight ahead, his eyes wide with terror, utterly unable to move. Standing at the foot of their bed, bathed in the faint moonlight filtering through the curtains, was the shimmering, translucent figure of a young woman in a flowing, old-fashioned white dress. It was Eleanor. Her long, dark hair cascaded over her shoulders, but her face was obscured by shadow and what looked like a thin, tattered veil. She wasn't just observing, she was gazing at them, her head tilted, an aura of profound sadness emanating from her. Then, Eleanor slowly raised her hand, her movements graceful yet unnervingly deliberate. She extended her forefinger, long and slender, and slowly, gently, touched Paul's forehead. As her translucent finger made contact, Paul's eyes snapped shut, and his body went completely rigid, his breathing entirely. A deep, resonating moan escaped Olivia's lips, not her own, but a sound that seemed to well up from deep within the room, ancient and full of sorrow. The ghostly figure of Eleanor then turned her veiled face towards Olivia, and Olivia felt an intense, crushing psychic pressure, a sudden, overwhelming wave of despair and heartbreak that was not her own. She was drowning in Eleanor's grief, feeling the loss of a lover, the emptiness of an unfulfilled life, the crushing loneliness that had driven Eleanor to linger. Olivia tried to scream, but her throat was locked.
She could feel Eleanor's cold, spectral presence drawing closer, her ethereal form shimmering, subtly shifting to reveal fleeting glimpses of something withered and ancient beneath the veil, not skin, but decaying lace and shadows where a face should be. Eleanor then reached out, her hand hovering just inches from Olivia's chest, radiating an intense, bone-chilling cold. A single, withered white orchid, identical to the one on the pillow, materialized in Eleanor's translucent fingers. As Eleanor began to lower the orchid towards Olivia's chest, a chilling whisper, like dry leaves rustling close to her ear, filled Olivia's mind. "He is mine now. I will make him beautiful. You will join my sorrow." Olivia's mind screamed, fighting the encroaching despair. She squeezed her eyes shut, fighting to reclaim her own thoughts, her own identity against the overwhelming wave of Eleanor's sorrow. When she opened them, Eleanor was gone. The room was silent. Paul was still rigid, but a faint, shallow breath now fluttered from his lips. The rocking chair was still. The white orchid was gone. They fled the plantation at dawn, not even bothering to pack, driving away in a blur of pure terror. Weeks later, back home, Paul seemed changed. He became withdrawn, melancholy, often gazing wistfully into the distance. He started humming old, sorrowful lullabies that neither of them knew. Olivia noticed a faint, sweet, decaying floral scent clinging to him, especially when he slept, and sometimes a cold spot would appear on his forehead, exactly where Eleanor had touched him. The haunted plantation of Cypress Bayou, Louisiana, hadn't just given them a honeymoon. It had given Eleanor a new groom, slowly consuming Paul's joy and replacing it with an eternal, heartbreaking sorrow, a permanent chilling bond that would forever connect him to the tragic mistress and her eternal lamentation.
Story 6. The Sunken Town of Lake Lanier, Georgia. Chloe and Marcus, eager for a unique honeymoon, rented a secluded lakeside cabin on Lake Lanier, Georgia. They were drawn by its picturesque beauty and the promise of water sports. They knew vaguely of the lake's dark history, that it covered a former town and graveyards, but dismissed it as local folklore. Their cabin was a modern, glass-fronted structure, offering panoramic views of the vast, often eerily still lake. The first few days were idyllic. However, on their third night, as a thick, unseasonal mist rolled in, completely obscuring the lake, Chloe woke to a faint, muffled church bell ringing from deep beneath the water. It was distant, distorted, but undeniably the sound of a bell tolling slowly, sorrowfully. Marcus, a light sleeper, heard it too. He dismissed it as distant buoys or auditory illusions from the fog. But as they listened, the bell's toll grew slightly louder, accompanied by a faint, collective murmur of voices, like a distant congregation whispering prayers, all seeming to come from directly beneath their cabin. A profound cold seeped into the room, a damp, unnatural chill that defied the cabin's heating. They huddled together, too unnerved to speak. The next morning the mist had cleared, but the lake's surface where the sounds had originated was now covered in thousands of small, perfectly circular air bubbles, constantly surfacing and bursting, releasing a faint, metallic, earthy smell. That day, They avoided the lake. That night, the phenomena intensified. The faint bell tolling and whispering congregation returned, now much clearer, accompanied by a rhythmic, heavy thudding that seemed to vibrate directly through the cabin's foundation, as if something immense was slowly walking on the lake bed beneath them. The metallic, earthy smell intensified, growing oppressive. Then a peculiar thing happened. The large framed photograph of the lake hanging on their wall, usually serene, began to subtly change. The water in the picture seemed to darken, and faint, blurred outlines of submerged structures, chimneys, roofs, even a steeple began to emerge from the painted depths, as if the lake in the picture was revealing its hidden, drowned secrets. Fear turned to terror when the thudding grew louder, sounding directly beneath their bedroom. The low, whispering congregation became a frantic, desperate chorus of silent screams that echoed directly in their minds, not through their ears. The room's electricity flickered violently, then died, plunging them into absolute darkness, illuminated only by the faint, eerie glow of their phone screens. From the vast black expanse of the lake outside their glass-fronted cabin, a single, impossibly tall figure slowly began to rise from the depths. It was entirely composed of dark, churning lake water, vaguely humanoid but gargantuan, its form rippling and reforming, reaching upwards towards their cabin. The bell tolling became a frantic, deafening clanging, and the silent screams in their minds became a chaotic, overwhelming wave of despair and terror, begging for release. The colossal water figure paused, its head reaching above the cabin, and its form solidified just enough for them to see two enormous, hollow eyes like dark abysses that stared directly into their bedroom window. The lake's surface below it began to boil and churn, revealing glimpses of sunken wooden structures and skeletal trees. Then one of the enormous watery arms slowly extended towards their cabin, its fingers distending into long, grasping tendrils of water, reaching for the glass. They fled the cabin, scrambling into their car, not even attempting to start it. They just sat, huddling, watching in horror as the colossal water entity pressed its watery hand against their cabin's glass front, slowly enveloping it, the silent screams and frantic bell tolls reaching a deafening crescendo in their minds. The cabin slowly began to implode, pulled inward by the watery entity as if being consumed by the lake itself. They started the car and sped away as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, never looking back at the lake or the spot where their cabin had been. Weeks later, back home, Chloe found a faint, circular, unnaturally damp mark on the back of her hand, right where she had rested it against the glass when watching the rising figure. It never dried. Marcus, meanwhile, began to hear phantom church bells tolling in the distance, always when he was alone, always when the world was quiet. The sunken town of Lake Lanier, Georgia, wasn't just a lake. It was a hungry, aquatic grave, rising in the dead of night to claim new souls, leaving an enduring, chilling dampness that would forever remind them of what lurked beneath the calm surface, waiting to drag them into its silent, watery depths.
Story 7. The Haunted Lighthouse Keeper's Cottage, Outer Banks, North Carolina.
Isabel and Finn, seeking romance and solitude, rented a charming, historic lighthouse keeper's cottage on a remote stretch of the Outer Banks, North Carolina. The cottage, weathered and ancient, stood alone amidst swaying dunes and whispering seagrass, far from the bustling tourist towns. It promised undisturbed peace, but came with a local legend of a heartbroken keeper who vanished during a hurricane, leaving his lantern burning. Their first 2 days were perfect. Long walks on the deserted beach, evenings cooking by candlelight. However, on their third night, as a thick coastal fog rolled in, Isabel awoke to a peculiar, rhythmic scratching sound coming from the wooden floor directly beneath their bed. It was a slow, deliberate scrape, 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 like something heavy being dragged across rough planks. Finn, a deep sleeper, remained oblivious. She nudged him awake. "Did you hear that?" The scratching stopped. Finn, groggy, blamed the old house. But as he drifted back to sleep, the scratching resumed, accompanied by a faint, cold draft that seemed to emanate directly from the floorboards, chilling their bare feet. They spent the rest of the night huddled, listening, the cottage feeling claustrophobic and ancient. The next morning, they discovered a series of deep, parallel gouges carved into the floorboards directly beneath their bed. 3 distinct, long marks that clearly hadn't been there the day before. They looked freshly made, as if something incredibly strong had been dragged repeatedly across the wood. That day, they tried to shake the unease. That night, the scratching returned, louder and more frantic, now accompanied by a low, guttural moaning that seemed to vibrate through the entire cottage. The cold draft intensified, and the air grew heavy with the scent of damp earth and something subtly metallic, like old rust. Then, as they lay rigid in bed, the heavy, antique wooden dresser in their room slowly, audibly, began to shift across the floor, scraping loudly against the planks, moving itself directly in front of the bedroom door, completely blocking their exit. It was far too heavy for any normal person to move alone. Fear turned to terror as the moaning grew louder, emanating from directly beneath their bed. The scratching intensified into a frenzied clawing, and the cold draft became an arctic blast, making their teeth chatter. The bedroom door, now barricaded by the dresser, began to subtly bulge inward around the lock, as if something immensely strong was pushing against it from the outside. Then, from directly beneath their bed, a dark, viscous liquid began to slowly seep up through the gouges in the floorboards, pooling onto the wood. It was thick, oily, and glowed with a faint internal phosphorescence, smelling faintly of the sea and something deeply putrid. As the putrid liquid spread, an ancient, withered hand, impossibly long and covered in barnacles and what looked like decaying seaweed, slowly pushed its way up through the largest gouge, its fingers splayed, reaching blindly into the air, beckoning. The moaning from beneath the bed intensified into a deafening wail, a chorus of lost souls trapped in the depths, filled with unspeakable longing and profound despair. The cottage shook violently, as if a hurricane was raging around them, but the night outside was utterly still and silent. The hand twitched, then slowly retracted back into the floorboards, pulling the glowing, viscous liquid back down with it, leaving only the chilling dark gouges. They broke the window and climbed out, scrambling into their car, driving in a blur of pure, unadulterated terror, never looking back at the haunted cottage that pulsed with unseen horror. Weeks later, back home, Isabel developed a persistent deep ache in her joints, especially when the weather turned damp, and sometimes she swore she could smell that faint putrid scent of the sea and decay. Finn, meanwhile, began to experience terrifying nightmares of being trapped beneath shifting sands and dragging something heavy in the dark. And once he woke up to find 3 deep, parallel gouges inexplicably carved into the wooden floor beside his own bed. The lighthouse keeper's cottage on the Outer Banks wasn't just haunted, it was a living tomb, a hungry, ancient entity of the sea and earth that had chosen them, slowly pulling them into its suffocating embrace, leaving an indelible, chilling mark that would forever connect them to the horrors buried beneath the dunes.